right, it looks like our numbers have stabilized a little bit, so let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the webinar. The Office of Global Health Initiatives at the University of Kentucky is pleased to present No One is Safe Until Everyone is Safe, the Interconnectedness of the World in the COVID Vaccination Era. I'm Melody Ryan. I'm a professor of pharmacy and the Assistant Provost of Global Health Initiatives at the University of Kentucky, and I'll be the moderator for today. Let's start with just a few housekeeping items. We are in the Zoom webinar mode, so you are muted and your video is disabled. That allows us to maximize the broadband. So because of that, if you have comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you only want to send them to the panelist, there is a drop down for that. If you want to send them to everyone, make sure you choose panelist and everyone. If you do have questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A field at the bottom of the screen. Push that and it'll pop up. You can also upvote questions if you see one that's similar to the thing you were going to ask with a thumbs up, so that we know which questions are most important to most people. You can also activate a closed captioning by choosing the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen, and you can adjust that there. If you have any technical problem, please place that in the chat and we will try to assist you. And if the webinar is disrupted for any reason, such as a power outage, just give us a few minutes to transfer the webinar control and then we'll be back on the same link. We will be recording the webinar and we'll send out that recording in the next few days. Now let's begin with our first panelist. First, we have Zachary Porterfield Md Phd, who will be discussing the vaccination status of the world. Dr. Porterfield is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky in 3 departments: the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics, the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, and the Department of Internal Medicine, Division of Infectious Diseases. Additionally, he's an honorary senior lecturer at University of KwaZulu-Natal School of Clinical Medicine in South Africa. Dr. Porterfield?
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat and kick us off here. We have some outstanding talks, and I'm excited to spend the first few minutes just talking about the vaccine status of the world and what this means moving forward. And I just, Craig, I apologize. Am I advancing the slides?
I am.
Thank you. Yeah, we can go to next slide. Thank you very much. And we can go to the next one as well. So I think it's worth starting by just talking about what vaccines are and just have a sort of basic starting ground for the discussion that we'll have today. From the immune system's perspective, everything is really about shape. And so when your immune system responds to an infection, whether it be a virus or a bacteria, it really is responding to protein shapes on the surface of that molecule or sometimes within that molecule. If we can hit next slide, Craig. The way that the shapes are made and the way that life is built is through a series of steps in which you start with DNA, you make a temporary copy of the DNA known as RNA or mRNA, and that's used as the instructions to build proteins. And really proteins are small machines and shapes that allow us to do, allow the cell, the virus, the bacteria to do the things that it needs to do. If we can hit next again. And really thinking about this is a bit like having a master copy or blueprint within the nucleus of the cell, where we have the DNA molecules, which contain the instructions for all the things that we need to build to have cells that are running. And then we make a temporary photocopy known as an mRNA photocopy, and we use that photocopy to help us build the shapes out. If we hit next, please. So if we think about a virus, and so we have a virus pictured at the top of the screen, and this is SARS-CoV-2 pictorially, the immune system is going to be recognizing self and non-self based on protein shapes. So you can see that the virus here is decorated with all sorts of protein shapes on the exterior, and the big yellow ones are the spike protein, which we hear quite a bit about. And if you hit next again, the virus's entire job is to take a copy of DNA or mRNA and place it into the cell and have the cell make proteins for it. A virus doesn't have enough complex machinery to replicate itself, and so it takes over the body's system to make more of itself. And so just sort of setting this as the grounds for, how do we make vaccines? Starting with DNA, then moving on to RNA, and then building a protein molecule is how life works and functions and replicates. Next slide, please. If we think through the kinds of vaccines that exist in the world, one of them, and one of the older technologies, is known as an attenuated virus. And so this is where you take a live virus and you attenuate it or make it weaker, and you expose the body to a weaker version of the virus, which gives the body a chance to start to recognize all of those shapes and create an immune response. If we go to the next one, inactivated viruses are where we completely inactivate, usually with formaldehyde and heat and a combination of other treatments. And this, again, allows the body to start to see the viral shapes. And the immune system is constantly scanning through and saying, this cell belongs to me, this cell belongs to me, this is a new cell that doesn't belong to me. I can tell because it has these foreign proteins on the surface. If we go to next, please. Another technology is using a virus-like particle, and this is sort of where we take the DNA engine out of the virus. And so in the first two cases, these are attenuated and inactivated and very unlikely to cause illness. And we have some very successful vaccines, including MMR, yellow fever, dengue, polio, and hepatitis A. In a virus-like particle, we've taken all of the DNA or RNA out of the virus, and we're just using that protein shell to let the immune system start to see to start to recognize it and mount an immune response. And if we go to the next one. And then the last protein-based vaccine is just to use the subunit vaccine. So this is where we're just giving just those external proteins or some specific viral proteins to the immune system to allow it to train and start to fight the infection. Interesting things about proteins and protein-based vaccines is proteins are relatively difficult to make. This is very complex molecular origami. And so creating a shape and then keeping it stable and preserving it and delivering it and then injecting it and making sure that it's still folded into the correct shape is quite a tricky thing to do. So if we go to the next slide, some of the newer vaccine technologies are gene-based. And so the idea here is not to give the protein of the virus to the immune system to start to recognize it and make the immune response, but to give the instructions for building the protein and allow the body's own machinery to make the protein. Our body uses mRNA and all the time to make proteins. And so we're just using the system that our body naturally uses to make every protein that we need for life to help stimulate the immune system. There are some ways to deliver that gene. So you have both replicating viral vectors, and if we go to next, non-replicating viral vectors. And so this is using a virus background or using the virus as a Trojan horse to insert genes into the cell. The reason to do this is that viruses' entire job is to take small pieces of DNA and get it introduced into cells. And so we can use a replicating viral vector, or if we go to next, a non-replicating viral vector. And there that GOI is gene of interest. So we're giving the blueprint, the photocopy of the blueprint to the body to make the protein that we need. And if we go to next, there are two other ways to introduce a gene. One is with a DNA vaccine. And if we go to the final one, this is an mRNA vaccine. And the whole idea is that we're really sending a letter to the immune system with instructions to make the protein, and then we have the body build the shape. And so if we can do next again, sorry. So mRNA vaccines are shown here in the end. And so the idea is that we're using a combination of a lipid envelope. So this is just a little bit of fat that allows the RNA to get into the cells, combined with the RNA to make the protein. And we introduce that into the body. And so while these are newer technologies, they seem to have been, or they've been incredibly promising. And I think that we've seen outstanding results from the mRNA vaccines here in the United States. If we go to next. I like this quote from Tom Frieden, who's the ex-director of the CDC. He says an mRNA vaccine, which is what we have, and actually go back one, is an amazing technology. It doesn't actually contain the virus itself. This is an email sent to your immune system. It shows what the virus looks like, instructions to kill it, and then like a Snapchat message, it disappears. This is amazing technology. And mRNA lasts for a very short period of time, but gives the body the instructions to make the proteins. All right, so next slide. So now we'll start talking about all of the things that are going on in vaccinology for COVID-19 at the moment. There are 100 vaccine candidates. This is unprecedented. 283 trials with 13 approved vaccines. We have everybody working in the same direction. So there's often a lot of discussion about how quickly this happened and how amazing this is that we have something in such a short period of time. But it really is because we have so many horses in the race to develop a successful vaccine. Next slide, please. If we look at where vaccines are going to be distributed, this is from The Economist, a map of when we expect vaccines to be widely available. So if we look at the United States, we expect widely available vaccines by September to March 2022 at the very latest, but sort of by fall. And if we look at places like Central Africa, we are looking into 2023. And this is an enormous crisis. This is not only an ethical crisis, but also has implications from a viral evolution standpoint and a huge economic dilemma for the world. Our world is based on trade, travel, interconnected is increasingly dependent on that. And so having any area where we aren't effectively treating the virus is really a global problem. The viral evolution is particularly an issue, and so Frank Romanelli is going to talk about vaccine mutants. But if we have freely circulating virus anywhere in the world, it is generating new mutations that can then come back and escape vaccines. So we really have to make a concerted effort to get everyone vaccinated as soon as possible. Next slide, please. Looking at who has purchased vaccines thus far, European Union and United States have been heavy purchasers. India also has purchased quite a few vaccines, but you're seeing a couple of high-income countries purchasing most of the world's vaccines. On the right side, you see COVAX, and if we go to the next slide, this is a coalition of vaccine groups, including CEPI, Gavi, UNICEF, and World Health. And these are leaders in sort of delivering vaccines to at-risk and in-need populations. And if we hit next again, COVAX has brought together a coalition to support 92 lower income economies and eliminating the barrier to pay. So having a worldwide grouping of individuals funding these vaccine technologies, funding these vaccines efforts, with the goal of delivering 20% or 2 billion doses to 20% of the world's most at-risk population by the end of 2021 is an incredibly important goal. And so there are things that are occurring with COVAX that otherwise would be impossible, and we're starting to really treat that vaccine desert in the middle of of Central Africa and other at-risk areas. Next slide, please. It's important to know that this is not just a global problem, but also a local problem. And if we think about what's happening here in the United States, this is a map of where we expect patients to be able to get both vaccines of a 2-vaccine set. And so what you're seeing are lots of dark areas, which are areas that are at least 50 miles from a nearest pharmacy where you might be able to get a vaccine. And so if we hit next slide again, this is something that exists in Kentucky. You know, this is not a problem around the world, but truly a problem for our communities and our neighbors. And if we look, especially into Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, there are a lot of communities that are really suffering from a lack of ability to easily get vaccine. Next slide, please. So this leads to some very important questions, and we have some time with the panel and some excellent presentations. But what happens if we don't treat this global pandemic as a global issue? I think it's important to think why Kentucky matters to the world and why the world matters to Kentucky, and then how do we empower vaccine equity? And so these are obviously big questions and tough to cover in 5 to 7 minutes, but certainly gives us some food for thought. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Porterfield. That was rapid, but very intriguing. So if you all have questions for any of our panelists at any time, feel free to go on and place those in the Q&A panel under the screen. And we'll next move on with our next panelist, who is Dr. Frank Romanelli, PharmD, MPH, and he will talk about why variants matter. Dr. Romanelli is currently the Paul F. Parker Endowed Professor of Pharmacy, with joint appointments as Associate Professor of Medicine and Associate Professor of Physician Assistant Studies. He also serves as Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Chief Academic Officer for the College of Pharmacy. Dr. Romanelli?
Thanks, Melody. Craig, if you could just jump ahead 2 slides, I think. And one more. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, I think Zach did a great job of setting the stage of the immune system and what happens with the immune system. I'm going to try to convince you that mutants matter and variants are very important. And I'm going to open with this statement, which I'm probably going to repeat several times over the next 5 minutes, or at least a few times, that if a virus is not replicating, it's not mutating. So that's very important. A virus can't mutate unless it's replicating. And for all intents and purposes, replication means infection. So you'll see how that all ties together as we walk through this. So first of all, I'm going to talk about mutations. What is a mutation? Zach and I ironically didn't talk much about what we were each going to talk about, but we both ended up putting the word shape on one of our slides, which I think is kind of very telling. What mutations are is amino acid substitutions. So Zach talked a lot about proteins and how we're concerned about proteins. Proteins are a bunch of amino acids chained together. So if you think of a moving train, each one of those boxcars is an amino acid. And those amino acids all together, or those boxcars all together, form one long protein or one long train. What a mutation is one amino acid or more amino acid substitutions, which essentially, if the virus swaps out an amino acid, the protein changes. And what we say is typically that amino acid substitution leads to a change in conformation. And that's just a fancy way of saying shape. So when that amino acid substitute changes, the shape changes. And that's critically important because when we're designing vaccines or therapies to thwart a vaccine, or in many cases a bacteria, we're focused on a specific shape. And if that shape changes, unfortunately, the therapeutics of the product we've developed may be impacted, and many other things may be impacted. So chemically, that's what a mutation is. It's a substitution in amino acid that leads to a change in the shape of a protein. So what is a variant? A variant is a genomic departure from the wild type. The wild type is the predominant or the base strain of a viral or bacterial infection. So essentially, we can say that the original viral strain that originated in the market in China was the wild type. That was the original predominant strain, essentially the genetic father of all the subsequent strains. So when you have a variant, that strain has now departed from the wild type. It has changed. It is no longer like the predominant type or the original sequence or sequence 0. A specific strain is a phenotypic departure from the wild type. So it does different things. Not only is it genetically different, but it also acts different because of that genetic change. One interesting thing to watch in terms of variants and mutants as we've plugged along is scientists have argued about how to name these variants, and we eventually landed on the pangolin system, which defines these major lineages, and the system, which is a computer-derived program, tracks all the minor changes and then assigns it a name based on what lineage the viral strain is. Next slide. So when we talk about what's mutating, what we're specifically interested in is if you look at that spike glycoprotein, one of the spikes on the outside of COVID-19. Next slide. We're worried about that back, Craig, sorry. We're worried about that spike glycoprotein and that spike glycoprotein changing shape. And the reason we're so interested in that spike glycoprotein changing shape is, as you could see that little syringe there, the vaccine is targeting that spike glycoprotein. So when that spike glycoprotein changes shape, the vaccine may fail because the vaccine, kind of like a coffee cup and a coffee lid, the vaccine is trying to develop coffee lids that fit a specific coffee cup. And what happens is that virus changes its coffee cup, and now that lid won't securely fit on that protein any further. Next slide. So a lot of these mutations are essentially errors, and RNA viruses create more errors than DNA viruses. Coronaviruses, like COVID-19, are actually an RNA virus. And the interesting thing about when these errors and these mutations occur is sometimes they increase the fitness of the virus and sometimes they decrease the fitness of the virus. When they decrease the fitness of the virus, we usually don't care and we go along our way and we're happy that the virus became less fit. When we're concerned is when those mutations increase the fitness of the virus. Next slide. And here are some of the implications of that increased fitness. So a mutated virus or a variant may have implications on transmission. So the virus may transmit more easily. The virus may become more virulent. Its morbidity or mortality effects may increase. The virus may evade diagnostics, right? We may not be able to detect variants as well as we could. Our antiviral drugs and the antibodies that were, you've heard about convalescent plasma and some of the drugs we've developed to thwart COVID-19, those antivirals and those antibodies may no longer work once a mutation has occurred. Natural immunity may suffer. What we're really concerned about is vaccine immunity. So the immunity that the vaccines produce may suffer when a mutation has occurred, and the epidemiology may change. Next slide. So here are some of the known variants. Some of these you've heard of, and some of these you haven't. If you look at implications, you can see some of the implications. I think 1.3b, 1.351, the South African variant, which is actually the predominant strain in South Africa, we know that that increases transmissibility of that variant, and it also decreases the efficacy of some of the antibodies that we use to treat COVID-19. So you can see some of the downstream effects of the variants. Next slide. So I'm going to leave you with why do variants emerge? Why do mutations occur? And again, remind you that the more infections we have, the more mutations occur, the more variants occur. Sometimes the mutations occur simply because of natural byproducts of the virus is replicating. Incomplete infections. So sometimes people get mild infections, or they're elderly and they don't fight off the infection completely, and that leads to the ability of a mutant to occur, and potentially incomplete vaccination. So people that only get one dose of a vaccine instead of two, that may sort of also drive the epidemic. So we need to worry about mutants. And the reason that the vaccine diplomacy is so important is if we're not thwarting replication everywhere, then there's pockets of infection occurring. Where there's pockets of infections, there's pockets of mutations developing. And I'll stop there and turn it back over to Dr. Ryan.
Thank you, Dr. Romanelli. I think that leads us very handily into our next topic about vaccine diplomacy. And our presenter there will be Dr. Mrna Koch, PhD, and she is a medical anthropologist whose research focuses on cultural and political aspects of global health interventions and practices. Dr. Koch has conducted qualitative research about responses to tuberculosis in post-Soviet Georgia and the health effects of displacement in the context of civil war and humanitarian interventions in Georgia. And that's Georgia, the country, right, Dr. Koch?
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks to everyone for organizing this and inviting me. It's a real delight actually to be involved in a conversation that's bringing together people from across the UK community and hopefully more locally and maybe even beyond to discuss these important issues. And I really appreciate and enjoyed the two previous presentations. And I agree that mutants matter. And that vaccine diplomacy is crucial right now. I am a cultural anthropologist who works at the intersections of medical anthropology, anti-racist feminist and science and technology studies, and critical global health studies. And one of the things that this means is that I'm very interested in human microbe relationships. And I like hanging out in laboratories with bench scientists. Okay, so I was invited to focus on vaccine diplomacy. And as anyone who's been following the news for the past, 13, 14 months is aware, this topic in mass media outlets and other social media platforms has become quite a buzzword. This is a very dynamic narrative, and I think a very forceful aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic. So while I think we could talk a lot about historical parallels between responses to this pandemic and previous ones across history, I think it's worth noting that one of the unique things we're seeing with COVID-19 is this very strong uptick in discourses around vaccine diplomacy and the kinds of actions that they're mobilizing at a range of levels. So I played with the title a little bit to include the exclamation point and the question mark, just to kind of emphasize not just the urgency of this issue, but also how very complex and nuanced it is from a cultural standpoint. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm very pro-vaccine, and I agree with a lot of arguments in favor of vaccine diplomacy, and that, you know, wealthier nations should absolutely boost and support rollout globally. And I'm not really interested in the question of whether or not vaccine diplomacy is good or bad. I want to argue instead that in light of the conversations in the mass media and elsewhere, policy, so on and so forth, about how the COVID pandemic has quote unquote been politicized, I want to emphasize that all infectious and other health inequalities are always already political and cultural. Nobody has to politicize them. They're always political. They're always rooted in, you know, as I think both Zach and Frank highlighted a little bit, global inequities related to things like trade, commerce, colonialism, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in approaching this topic as a way to highlight and provoke a little bit of discussion about how the global COVID-19 pandemic can actually create some opportunities for us to decolonize global health. I think that there are already, and certainly will continue to be in the future, very important lessons to be learned and from this pandemic. And, you know, if we had more time, I would reference things like responses to smallpox, polio vaccination campaigns in Africa and the Middle Eastern nations, which have sparked a lot of political military activities, Ebola, the quote unquote Mexican swine flu, and so on and so forth. Okay. So as I said a minute ago, the phrase vaccine diplomacy has been become quite a buzzword with very powerful effects. And it basically refers to how a state's or a country's distribution of vaccines beyond its national boundaries can catalyze and symbolize, or maybe even shut down, relationships between regions, nations, and so on and so forth. So it's probably not surprising to hear that as an anthropologist, I'm interested in culture, but what might be a little unusual for some people is that I'm not just interested in culture in the broader sense of a group of people, their beliefs, practices, and how that can influence health. I actually study cultural aspects of global health, knowledge, expertise, institutions, and practices. And this means that we must always consider and reconsider the values and the beliefs and the assumptions and practices that constitute the broader global health arena. This is not anti-science by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually arguing that understanding how people are trained as biomedical practitioners, health policy experts, global health experts, and so on and so forth, and how those institutions operate are not value-free. And so one of the things I'm suggesting here is that if we look at things like vaccine research, development, rollout, so on and so forth, we can see that the experiences of people like scientists, healthcare experts, policymakers, and so on and so forth are influenced by legacies of things like global capitalism, colonialism, including settler colonialism. We are in Kentucky and the United States, after all, slavery and racism, and so on and so forth. So a couple of the questions I'm interested in are, what counts as expert knowledge in these debates? Who gets to sit at the table? Where are those tables located? And so on and so forth. Could I have the next slide, please? So when I reference decolonizing global health and the colonial legacies of global health practices, this is what I'm talking about. I'm interested in this growing conversation, I think not only in the mass media, but also very much importantly in global health education programs, public health journals, and so on, about how we need to flip the script and take very seriously the legacies, the unquestionable ties between white supremacy, racialization, colonialism, the global expansion of capitalism, and the pandemic that we're in right now. So again, this is an opportunity, as much as it is, I think, a tragedy and an emerging landscape of some errors that have been made along the way. And part of what we're seeing and experiencing in the vaccine geopolitics and diplomacy debates is related to COVID-19 is the normalization of blaming. And names and categories and classifications, not just of viruses, but of places and people and certain groups of people are extremely important here and potentially harmful, because places, populations, groups of people who are already marginalized are often used as scapegoats to kind of narrate pandemic origin stories and to direct the avenues through which and the mechanism through which we respond to them. Could I have the next slide? And so one of the ways that I wanted to kind of show this was just by putting together some headlines. And in preparing for this, I've become literally dizzy every morning trying to keep up with, the tag of vaccine diplomacy in the mass media. And again, I'm not taking sides, but I do want to emphasize that the names, the categories, the forms of classification of virus strains, of variants, et cetera, draw on and reproduce hatred, xenophobia or fear of others, and racism. This can not only cause harm to people via lack of access to vaccines, vaccine hesitancy, I think is something maybe we could talk about, vaccine skepticism, vaccine refusals, and so on and so forth. These are often justified by history. So as someone who works with living populations as an anthropologist, I'm also arguing that we need to take history very seriously. Could I have the next slide? Thank you. And I think we can see this in some of these headlines that are not at all value neutral. Somehow there's a Brazilian coronavirus variant that is possibly attributed a national identity or a cultural identity. And I think if we look at these headlines from an anthropological perspective that argues that the field of global health is not value neutral, we can appreciate how important it is to not only foster more interdisciplinary conversations locally, like we're doing here today, but also globally, but also how important it is to decolonize global health practices and discourses and institutions by taking very seriously the historical legacies of white supremacy and colonialism and racism in things like global health, pharmaceutical, medical education, policy and programs. So culture is everywhere. And I think we need to take that very seriously. I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Koch. That is setting us up, I think, for some great discussion in the discussion section. But at the moment, we're going to move right on to our final panelist, who's Mark Kivanini, PhD, CPH, who will end our formal discussion with a history of vaccination campaigns in low and middle income countries. Dr. Kivanini is a professor and chair of health, behavior and society, and the development dimensions international endowed professor in the College of Public Health at the University of Kentucky, a position he's held since 2018. In addition to his appointment in health, behavior, and society, Dr. Kivanini is a member of the Cancer Prevention Program at Marquis Cancer Institute and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Health Equity Transformation. Bring us home.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. It's exciting to see so much interest in this tremendously important topic. If I could have the next slide, please, Craig. So up until this point in the talk, you have heard what I at least found to be some absolutely fascinating things about the depths of immunological and pharmaceutical work that went into the development of the vaccines that we have for COVID-19 at this point, the critical importance of thinking about how virology works and how transmission of viruses happen, and then some of the complexities that come up when we think about pandemics in a global context. I'll argue that none of that matters from a public health perspective if we don't do a critically important thing, which is to get shots in arms. If we don't successfully have people vaccinated against COVID-19, all of the important scientific work that was done in vaccine development, all of the groundbreaking work that we've done over the past year to understand the virus, understand it quickly enough to be able to use our existing mRNA-based vaccination technology to create, the first 2 vaccines, and then other technologies to create the other ones, it all falls apart. So what I'd like to do with this talk is not so much offer a history of vaccination campaigns, but what I think are some important themes that have to be considered if we're going to successfully get shots in arms in a global context. And if I could have the next slide, please. And essentially what all of those lessons come down to is to think about the lenses through which we see vaccination and how we go about creating success at vaccination programs. And I want to argue that we often start with lenses that are far too simple for a world, next slide please, that is always more complex than we think it is. I see some of my friends from my evidence-based public health course in the room. I'm glad y'all are here, but one of the things that they've heard me say more than once is that health and public health is always more complicated than you think it is. And it's always more complicated than you think it is, even after you start thinking about how complicated it is. And that's a common theme across many areas of scientific inquiry. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do to develop lenses and ways of thinking about vaccination campaigns that match the complexity of the reality in which we see them? Next slide. And I'll argue that the common theme across looking at vaccination programs that have worked and vaccination programs that have not worked, and therefore what we have to keep in mind all the time as we're rolling out COVID-19 vaccines within the Commonwealth of Kentucky, within the United States, globally, these themes are the same, is that taking a piecemeal parts-based approach doesn't necessarily add up to a whole successful vaccination program. So if you think about some of the issues that come up that you have heard mentioned already, is the issue around vaccine a problem of supply chains? As Dr. Porterfield talked about, the critical importance of getting vaccines to the countries that are suffering a high burden of COVID-19 and don't have access or financial wherewithal to obtain vaccines at this point. The answer to that is, of course, yes, it's a supply chain problem. And is it an individual problem around vaccine hesitancy, lack of understanding of vaccination, refusal to take the vaccine at the point of view of the decision-making of the individual people who are either going to sit in the chair and get the shot in the arm or not? Yes, absolutely it is. And is it a problem of rolling out the vaccination fast enough and from a logistics perspective, getting the temporal wheels flowing quickly enough to overcome the variants that Dr. Romanelli talked about and made clear the importance of? The quicker people are vaccinated, the less time we have to create variants. Absolutely, it is. And last but not least, is it fundamentally a problem that is not only individuals, not only healthcare organizations, and not only public health, but political organizations and countries and cultures more broadly, as Dr. Koch made very clear? Absolutely. So the key to success in all of these vaccination programs, in the next slide, please, is to take a systems level approach, that we have to think not only about these individual parts and put a spotlight on all of them, but we also need to think about how those elements integrate and become a system that creates success in vaccination. Having the supply chain issues completely worked out do nothing for us if, when those vaccines arrive in those communities, individuals aren't willing to be vaccinated. And we could go on with those kinds of examples of integration. But moreover, those things are not independent of each other. The political will and the push to get vaccine to countries is going to be in part dependent on people pushing for them and making it clear that it is essential that they receive them, and individuals in those countries exerting their political will to make it happen. And so you see shifts in how people's attitudes and beliefs and intentions for the vaccine frame the efforts that are put forward to make it happen, and vice versa. If there's no ability to get the vaccine, that has implications for how people are going to think and feel and believe about it. So a systems approach is essential for success in these areas. But one systems approach is not necessarily enough. And if I could have the next slide. Feeding off of what Dr. Koch was discussing for us, there are individual contexts, historical contexts, cultural contexts, political contexts, real live on the ground environmental contexts that shape what we need to do in each country. And so another thing that we've come to appreciate quite greatly over time is that an approach where public health and healthcare come in from a top down and say, this is the system we've developed, we are here to help you, doesn't work that well. It's essential to consider all of those political and anthropological and cultural components that Dr. Koch talked about in thinking about how we create campaigns that will work in each of the communities, each of the countries, right? Each of the continents, each of the cultures with which we are working. Because the issues that lead to vaccine hesitancy in one country are not necessarily the same as those that lead to hesitancy in another. And so a very culturally sensitive and community engaged approach to building the vaccine infrastructure in each of these countries is essential. When we come in as experts and we tell people what to do, they are quite rightfully insulted, right? Obstinate, pushback. In some cases, the efforts backfire. When we come in and understand context and work with the communities to build successful campaigns, we are far more successful at building the base we need to ensure vaccination for all. If I could have the next slide, please. Another thing to think about that related to this last point is that putting together the puzzle pieces to bring the people together for the systems approaches necessary for vaccine requires us to think not only culturally and community engaged, but to think about who the broad spectrum of partners are who are available to work with us on vaccine campaigns. This is not just a public health or not just a healthcare issue. Engagement of the community, engagement of educational organizations, engagement of community leaders and thought leaders, engagement of family heads and cultures where family is an important organizational unit is really critical, again, to bring together the puzzle pieces from vaccination. And then I want to amplify, finally, a point that Dr. Koch made, and if I could have the next slide, please. That when it comes to vaccination and really to any public health campaign, the personal is always political. The decisions that individuals make about vaccination, the decisions that countries, communities, whatever level of analysis we want to talk about make about engaging in our campaigns is always inherently political. That has a number of implications for us. Just 2 days ago, there was a murder of 3 public health officials working in Afghanistan on a polio vaccination campaign. It is not clear yet whether they were targeted because of the vaccination campaign or if they were targeted because they were female healthcare workers in a setting where a portion of the population has beliefs about the proper role for women in healthcare and other kinds of employment settings. That distinction matters not at all for the critical point that we're making, which is that the cultural context, the political context always becomes a part of what we're doing with vaccine. You see the same thing in some of the vaccine rollout headlines that Dr. Koch brought up, that which vaccine countries want. Is it the Russian vaccine? Is it the Chinese vaccine? Is it vaccines developed in the United States, in the European Union? Has a political context. And it's also critical to acknowledge that the present is always historical. One of the elements of vaccine hesitancy for public health broadly, and especially for public health efforts led in the United States, is that our track record in doing good by people in other countries is not solid. The slide that is here is from a set of experiments that were conducted by the US Public Health Service on prisoners and women in Guatemala in the 1940s and early 1950s. That historical legacy and other historical legacies of colonialism, of US as a public health and a world power shapes the way that people see our vaccine efforts. And we have to acknowledge and we have to take into account those efforts when we are making these kinds of decisions. And if I could have then the next slide. And ultimately, the punchline of all of this is that what we're trying to do is engage in successful persuasion at a number of levels of analysis. We're persuading individuals that they should be vaccinated. We're persuading communities, both public health communities and communities in which we're engaging, to be a part of vaccination campaigns. We're persuading countries to put in place the resources and the infrastructure necessary to do it. We're engaging the global community in persuading around cooperation and collaboration on these sorts of things. And in every single one of those types of communication and persuasion, for us to be successful, we always have to be aware and accept the full system and the full context in which we're working. And if I could have the last slide. And so ultimately, again, always keeping in mind that goal of getting shots in arms, which when someone is finally sitting in the chair with the healthcare worker there and the needle out, is finally a simple process. But all of the steps and all of the systems that come up before then are critically important to consider. And with that, I look forward to the question and answer session. And thank you so much for being a part of this session today.
Great, thank you, Dr. Kivanini. So let's begin the Q&A. We have several questions that have come in, and I'd like to direct the first one to Dr. Porterfield. You indicated that there are 13 approved vaccines, but we only have 3 in the US. What are the statuses of vaccines in other countries?
That's a really good question. And, this is a complicated thing to stay on top of. We have, hundreds of vaccine candidates that are being developed at, at a rapid pace around the world. I also work in practice in South Africa. And so they initially had purchased the Oxford vaccine and recently have started to acquire other vaccine candidates. And I probably can't give you a perfectly comprehensive answer. I think the Pfizer and Mrna vaccines have leapt ahead here because they had such promising results first. And the J&J vaccine, actually, which at the University of Kentucky, we were the #1 enrolling site in the world for that vaccine, which is pretty remarkable. But I anticipate that there will actually be many, many very successful vaccine candidates. I think that there is going to be a period of time where trials that are being run in other countries will need to be thoroughly evaluated by the FDA before they're approved here for work. And there are certain countries, Russia and China, aren't widely sharing a lot of the data that they're getting in terms of how the trials are being conducted. And so we have access to data from a lot of the studies, but some of them are a little less forthcoming initially. So I anticipate that, and in fact, if you look at the United States, we've bought just over 1 billion vaccines, and that's from Oxford, Pfizer, Novavax, Moderna, GSK, and Janssen, and that was as of December 8th. And so we have already sort of put our eggs in multiple baskets, trying to increase rapidly the number of people who can get vaccinated and the kinds of vaccines that are available. But it's, this is an ever-changing and very difficult situation to keep on top of.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, for Dr. Romanelli. Is there a way to predict how likely it is that the virus will mutate to render vaccines ineffective, or is it just totally up to chance? You're muted, Dr. Romanelli.
Yep. I'm going to, in the interest of time, make this probably more simple than anybody wants. But the two things that predict mutations when you look at a virus are replication rate and rate of errors. So the faster a virus is replicating and the more errors that it makes when it replicates. And you can look at viruses making errors in one of two ways. You could say, wow, those viruses are very intelligent, they mutate. Or you can step back and say, wow, those viruses are very not intelligent because they mutate all the time. But those are the two key factors: how quickly a virus replicates and the number of errors it makes. So one of the most sinister viruses is HIV. HIV replicates extremely quickly, and it is extremely error prone. So HIV has been a nightmare to treat. And we know we've been dealing with HIV since 1981 and still don't have a cure in the United States since 1981. And that's because high rate of replication, lots of errors. So take those two things into consideration. And then if we could look at the specific vaccine and say, is your vaccine targeting a protein that viruses typically mutate or don't mutate? Sometimes we're able to locate proteins or parts of proteins that the viruses never mutate. And if we can target that, then no matter what other mutations occur, if you can find some common sort of thread across the different viruses that don't mutate across the different variants, then you probably have a very stable vaccine. But those are the three things you're chasing: how much replication occurs, how many errors occur, and what is your vaccine targeting? How stable or unstable is the protein that your virus is targeting?
Okay, thanks for that answer. For Dr. Koch and Dr. Kivanimi, we have two that are a little bit related here. So they are, what role are large international health organizations like the WHO playing in the equitable distribution of vaccines? And does anyone have thoughts about the ways that developed countries or blocs might use vaccine distribution as a way of exercising power in the developing world or making economic inroads in developing countries, as opposed to distributing them for purely humanitarian reasons? This person is thinking specifically of the political division between the US, EU, and Russia and China, and the different vaccines being used in both blocs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I can take a starting stab at those, and then I would love to hear what Dr. Koch has to say, as well. I think with respect to the latter question, is vaccine distribution being used as a way of exerting global geopolitical influence? There's no doubt that the question to that is yes. I mean, I think that is a political reality and an international relations reality. I would also argue that from the perspective of the ultimate goal is to get vaccine in arms. One of the things that we frequently talk about in public health is that the success of any campaign involves identifying the stakeholders who are critical to your success and then understanding the motivations that are going to get them to come to the table to work with you. So while in an ideal world, those of us who come from a health perspective would love to see all of this distribution happen for purely humanitarian reasons, because health is a fundamental human right and it should be delivered. The reality is that the way that we are going to get many of the political and the economic stakeholders to the table is to push messages around the role that it can have on advancing, US influence or Soviet influence or Chinese influence, depending on who we're trying to persuade. And then also, I think the critical role that global vaccination plays in economic restart. That there's really no practical way that we can have the global economy recover without large-scale vaccination. And whether that feels like a crass motivation to get people to the table or not, that will be what is persuasive to those stakeholders. And those stakeholders are essential to what we want to do and how we want to be successful.
Dr. Koch, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, mostly just, I completely agree. I think it's, I think it's very clear. And this, again, history is extremely important. Dr. Kivanemi mentioned the Afghan health workers who were murdered. There's similar stories from polio vaccine campaigns in Pakistan within the past 2 decades and many other examples. And so I think it's clear that even something that is the most well-intentioned health campaign, whether it be primarily driven through a humanitarian organization like the International Committee for the Red Cross, right, Oxfam, so on and so forth, those are always already political entities. Non-governmental organizations are tied to global health funding streams, to very complicated webs of priorities and funding and also expectations. So I guess the only other thing that I would add to the response, in addition to yes, is I think we should also ask, through a humanitarian imperative or not, what kinds of strings are attached to these programs? Are there strings attached for how funding will be used in a particular way? What do those requirements and assumptions tell us about not just assumptions about what kinds of cookie cutter models, right, should be used and probably will fail because, like Dr. Kivenetzi said, you know, from the ground up, these won't work. You need to ask people what they need as the first step. But also, how might those kinds of assumptions and practices unintentionally undermine their very well-intentioned health programs? Paradoxically, how might they keep them from working well? So I think that's the only thing I would add. They're always political. And yeah, that's an excellent question.
Certainly it is a topic we could talk about for another entire hour, I think, without a doubt. So for everyone, there's a couple of questions about vaccine hesitancy. So do you have advice for advocating for the vaccine to those who are resistant to getting it or who only want to be vaccinated with a certain type, like if they're waiting for the Johnson & Johnson one, but the Pfizer vaccine is available today? And related to that, another person asked about, what do you say to someone who thinks the government is trying to microchip people with the shot, yet the bore of the needle is too small for any microchip?
I mean, I can take an initial stab. And I think Dr. Kivenetzi has really articulated that every person comes from a very different context, a very different background, and where you are, where you're from is incredibly important. And I think listening is probably the first step. That no matter what you do, if somebody doesn't want to get a vaccine, try to understand why. And, you know, if I come in and just say everyone needs a vaccine, you're you know, ridiculous if you don't get it, I've missed an opportunity to understand the community that I'm working in. And so I think starting there, I would also say for people who are waiting at the moment, all of the vaccines that we have available in the United States have excellent efficacy. So there are some differences in terms of prevention of any illness at all. But certainly preventing severe illness, they all seem to be incredibly robust. The side effect profiles exist and they're slightly different. In just a quick plug, you know, the side effects sort of mean that your immune system is working. You know, when you feel bad when you are ill, it's because your immune system is switched on and it's turning on a fever and it's, you know, churning out cytokines to fight infection, and it does make you feel crummy. But by comparison, you feel crummy for 24 hours, but it protects you from incredibly severe and deadly disease. And spreading severe and deadly disease. So it's one of these things that nobody likes the side effects. I didn't feel, you know, fabulous after I got my vaccine, but it was 1000% worth. And I would recommend getting whatever's available to you when you can get it.
Okay, I think we are out of time. So there are still good questions that people have asked. And I'm sorry that we're not able to get to every one of them because I think there's a lot more to be said on these topics. So I'd like to thank our attendees and thank our panelists for joining us. We certainly have enjoyed it and look forward to bringing more discussions together around these and other global health topics.